You must survive, or this game is serious. It's not a game. For to command the spontaneous is the fundamental contradiction. Yes, I think society may be within its rights in saying there are certain occasions in which your spontaneous feeling must not be expressed. But it's hardly within its rights to say there are certain occasions in which the appropriate spontaneous feeling must be expressed. You all remember as children nights when you stayed wide awake because you were excited or anxious or something. And your mothers came and said to you, "Now, darling, you must go to sleep. Try to go to sleep." And you know very well that the harder you tried, the more difficult sleep was. Or if any of you were unfortunate enough to have been brought up by mothers or nurses who had a constipation phobia, they would say to you, "You've got to do your daily duty," and they'd expect you to do it immediately after breakfast, as if this sort of thing could be simply assigned and commanded to happen. And when it wouldn't happen, because you weren't ready, they started to get anxious. I remember we had a graduated series of penalties. That the first failure got syrup of figs. The second failure got senna tea. The third failure got something called calomel. The fourth failure got cascara. And the fifth failure got castor oil, which was an infallible remedy. But a perfectly horrible one. And you know that bring this thing up because you had to obey the rules in this spontaneous functioning. Whereas, as a matter of fact, it doesn't matter a damn. If you leave it alone, it works. And but of course it has the slight inconvenience that it doesn't fit in with adult schedules, where they want to have the whole thing programmed. But this kind of pressure on children to do something spontaneous at a fixed time produces an enormous amount of conflict, a great deal of trouble, because you see, you are being asked to do something which is an involuntary act voluntarily. And this is a basic contradiction. And it constitutes, therefore, a double bind. The child is not smart enough to say to its mother, "But this going to sleep is involuntary. How can I do it voluntarily? You are asking me to do something absurd." Because if a child ever did get around to saying that to its mother, and I did say this to my parents, they say, "You're being impertinent." You may make comments of this kind. And so if this pressure is sufficiently severe, most children seem more or less to survive it. But if it's sufficiently severe, the child has no alternative but to retreat into an attitude where it is in effect saying, "I am not responsible for what I am doing. There is nobody home here." And this is a psychotic break. Now, notice this, that the structure of a double bind, of any individual being commanded to do something contradictory, if he takes the command seriously, this puts him in a situation where he is confronted with an insoluble problem. He has the feeling here that his life is a predicament, an ongoing and perennial predicament. Where he may work and where it may be good to work at finding the answer, but wherein the answer can never be found. And all the current feeling that the human situation is problematic and is necessarily problematic, and that there's nothing that can be done about it, and that man is a sort of embodied contradiction, is all based on the fact that not only familiarly, not only individually, but socially, we're in a double bind. Now you see, when you're trying to solve a problem that has no solution, that means a nonsense problem, your action to solve the problem becomes circular. You go round and round and round at the thing again and again and again and again and find no issue. And you know this of all sorts of people who in their private or family lives have an ongoing problem, something that's always being discussed, and the more it's discussed, the more completely confusing it becomes. Let's take a few situations out of ordinary family life, as just by way of a joke. It's very frequent for a wife to say to her husband, "Well, since you've married me, you don't show me very much attention. You haven't taken me to the movies in ages." And he realizes, indeed, he has gotten rather slack, and he hasn't taken her to the movies. 2 nights later, he says to her, "Darling, let's go to the movies." And she says to him, "Why, you're only saying that because I complained." Well, what is he to do? Well, he says, I sure wanted to take you to the movies. I'd like to go myself, and I know you complain, but you just reminded me. Something I wanted to do all along. Well, she says, "I'll believe that when it's happened often enough to see it." Or a real cute situation I heard of the other day, where a husband and wife agreed, she'd been shopping and he'd been at the office. They're going to meet downtown at a bar after he got out of the office and have a drink. So he'd had a very good day at the office. When they arrived at the bar, he was feeling wonderful. They sat down. He said, "What do you have?" Oh, she said, "Oh, anything." And the waiter came up and he said, "I'll have an old-fashioned and anything for the lady." And she said, "Why, that's just like you. Anything will do for me. Just anything will do for me." And the more he tried to explain, he said this was a joke, the more entangled the whole situation became. It was a joke. Just a joke. You think you can joke with me, just like anything, and you don't take me seriously at all. Woo! Well, these are all daily examples of double binds. And they create simply insoluble problems. Now, if you see, here's the point. If we're working on a double bind and trying to solve it, you can't solve it. And therefore, your course of action becomes circular. You go round and round and round and round and round and round. And this circular pattern is what is meant in Buddhism by the term samsara, which is formally opposed to nirvana. Samsara, going around and around the wheel of becoming, the wheel of birth and death, from which there's no escape, so long as you pursue it. And all ways of liberation, you see, are concerned with deliverance from samsara, from a pattern of life, in other words, which is a vicious circle. Now, let's next look at one double bind which society has succeeded imposing on every single one of us. not only is society saying our game is not a game, which is a double bind. This game you are playing is serious. But society is also saying to every one of us, you are a responsible source of action. You're an ego. Now, how does that come about? You see, the human being is a very, very wonderful organism, because the human nervous system is unique among all nervous systems in the world by having a very high degree of what we call feedback. Feedback is, of course, as you know, an engineering term to signify a process of giving a machine information about what it's doing. It is a second machine that tells the first machine about the results of its actions, so that it can correct them. And we have a very, very wonderful and highly refined feedback system in the relationship in the brain between what we might call the cortical and the subcortical centers. The subcortical centers in the brain consist of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And they are the primitive brain, the brain that is in the middle of the skull. And then over this grows this whole fold of the cortex. Now, all our lines of nervous information from all our sense contacts go firstly to the subcortical centers. And then between the subcortical centers and the cortex, there are all kinds of back and forth interconnections. And what is in effect happening is that the cortex enables us to have reports, recognizances, remembrances of all kinds of things that happen in the subcortical area. In this other fold, memories are stored, comparisons are made, and so you get a feedback situation as between these two centers of the brain. This is simplifying things, but still, this is roughly what goes on. So, in other words, the human organism has a very high possibility of self-control. And it has this possibility before any high culture develops. Wherever there is a human organism, this possibility exists. Now, when we bring up our children and when we instruct them in the culture, we resort almost universally in every culture in the world to a stratagem which divides the child into two parts. One of which is the soul and the other is the body. One of which is the will and the other is the instincts. One of which is reason and the other is the passions and appetites. And we say to that child, you must control your body like a rider on a horse. And so, at the same time, it is not simply the parents of the child, but other children and the whole social context that is giving each child an impression of what he is as the rider of the horse. Well, you do this way, But you don't do it enough that way. Well, you're all right insofar as this goes, but you're all wrong insofar as that goes. And so over the years, the child is told who he is and comes to feel that he is all that he has been told he is by other people. This is what the great social psychologist George Herbert Mead calls the interior, or the generalized other. And that's ourselves. The generalized impression of what other people have said about us. In this manner, we become self-conscious. You see, it's very easy to see. There was an old theory of the formation of society called the theory of the social contract. And that idea, which, say, Rousseau followed, was that society was constituted by a number of independent individuals coming together and contracting to live in a group. Well, this is a completely discredited idea. Every one of us has a father and a mother. That makes 3 people, and that's society. We didn't ask to be put in this situation. We arrived there. And so it would follow that since animal society, insect society, cellular society is prior to the development of any sense of individuality, that the sense of individuality is a social product. We become aware of individuality by our intercourse with other people. Our relationship to other people reflects ourselves back to us. And so from them we get a conception of ourselves. So far, so good. Fine. We would have, supposing the cortex is a feedback to the subcortical centers. What is going to be feedback to the cortex about the cortex and what it does? Well, there is no way of doing it except through other people. You can't open up your own skull and look into your own brain and find out how it works, but somebody else can. And he can say to you, well, this is what's inside your head. And so you can say to him, well, that's probably what's inside your head too. And in this way, we get feedback about things that we can't individually understand. But at the same time, when we split human beings in 2 and say one part of you is what we tell you you are and ought to be, the other part of you is what you are unfortunately by nature and what you've got to control. In other words, the Freudian division, say, between the superego, allied with the ego on the one hand, and the id, or the unconscious, on the other. When we get this, we teach the art of self-control to the child by splitting the child in 2. Now, I don't know, this may be necessary. But if it's necessary, it's something like Santa Claus. Something you tell children for a tactical and strategical purpose. And later, you ought to be able to say to them, that was a fairy tale. And we told it to you because you were a baby. In all sorts of cultures, children are disciplined by imaginary fears and threats. The goblins will get you if you don't watch out. This has been done for ages. Nowadays, we don't tell the children the goblins will get you. At least we don't think we do. We have new goblins, that's all. But this division of the human being into two parts, the soul and the body, the controller and the controlled, the ego and the non-ego, is a fiction. It is humbug. It may be useful, but it's humbug. But we never get around to the point of telling our children that it isn't so. And the reason for which most adult human beings have never grown up is that they have never discovered that they're all of a piece, and that the division between the ego and the unconscious, or whatever you want to call it, is fictitious. And if you don't find that out, you grow up, to use psychological language, permanently alienated. That is to say, you feel a permanent gulf between your controlling center and your spontaneous center. The physical organism is spontaneous. Every operation that it has is spontaneous. Happens, in other words, of itself. In childhood, because this spontaneous organism is capable of self-control, we are taught to mistrust and regulate spontaneous behavior. Fine. You know, all right. But this gives the impression that there is a second self beside the spontaneous one. And the more we identify ourselves with this non-spontaneous center, the more we find ourselves deprived of fundamental enjoyment. In other words, the body, the physical organism, is the organ of enjoyment. It is by this and by being this that we participate completely in the natural universe. But if we habitually learn, if we chronically identify ourselves with something that is not the organism, but which is the controller of it, then we begin to discover that we fail to participate in our experiences, and that therefore every experience becomes mildly frustrating, not quite enough. This is very typical of all sorts of cultured attitudes. We are taught nowadays, and this has been so for a long, long time, the adult is considered immature if he lets himself go. If you laugh very much or cry very much, if you dance very much, if you love very much, people say to you, well, this isn't very dignified, it's not very mature. And we all learn to cultivate a fundamentally reserved attitude towards everything that we do. Adults in our culture are distinctly zombies. Holding aloof from life, drab, unexpressive. You know, they think they're dancing when they're shuffling around the room. And all sorts of things like this, just terrible. Because there is the fear that if you submit to spontaneity, it will run away with you. Now I go back, there may be a point to saying to the child, you must restrain your spontaneity, or it will run away with you. You must learn how to control it. But when you have learned how to control it, you have to get with it and not be any longer alienated from it. Because if you go on and on and on, being constantly alienated from yourself and standing outside it, as I said, nothing will be without the element of frustration in it. And therefore, one will develop a feeling that since no moment's experience is satisfactory, you've got to have more and more and more and more and more moments, more time. And from this arises the compulsion to survive. Also, because you see your body is wearing out, you start to resent it. You start to resent being a body. Because you see that this thing is saying to you, time, gentlemen, please. There are limits to your going on. And in this case, then, civilization becomes a fight against death. How can we put it off? And so death becomes the great problem. Now, what a way of liberation does is to take the child aside at a certain age when he has learned to discipline himself and say, listen, old boy, you know, all this business about your being the ego and there being the animal, the rider and the horse, on the other hand, it's the bunk. It was a joke. And let's get together again. Only it doesn't do it quite that way. For you see, what happens is this. When society tells the individual, the child in this case, you are responsible for what you do. What is this saying? It's saying we are playing this social game as if each one of us were a source of action. As if each one of us were a place from which activity originates. We start it. And therefore, wherever an action starts, the place where it starts is the responsible place. You did this, so you can be praised or blamed accordingly. This is what is explicit in the rules. What is implicit in the rules, however? What's implicit in the rules is that it's by virtue of the rules that we are this way. In other words, our individual independence is conferred on us by society, and the fact that it's conferred on us by society is repressed. And so we've got a contradiction. Society gives us our independence and takes it away from us at the same time. Saying, in other words, to us, you must act freely. Saying, in other words, to us, you must act freely. And this is the same contradiction as saying you must be spontaneous. You must love. You must go to the Johnny at 9 o'clock. And if we don't see this trick, we're in quite a muddle. Now, you may even question, quite seriously, my whole thesis and say, well, I'm not a free agent, an independent source of action, because society has told me so. I am. And I'm sure I would have known it, whether I'd been told so or not. And any suggestion that we are not such free agents may be resisted on the grounds that if we're not, then unfortunately we must be nothing but determined, mechanical and helpless puppets. But actually, if we look at what a human organism is and does, in the most clearly scientific and objective way that we can manage, we find a different situation altogether, which is neither voluntaristic nor deterministic. Here is a very, very important point. What's the difference between the human organism and the rest of the world? Where do we stop and where does the world begin? Well, physically speaking, we are usually defined by our skins. The epidermis is the boundary which separates us from everything else. But of course, if we think about it clearly, we know that this isn't quite so. What about the air that goes inside the epidermis, doesn't it? Isn't the external air not ourselves? It penetrates into our lungs. It goes all through the alimentary canal. It goes through the pores. They all breathe. So my boundary has to be made somewhat more complicated. It's not only a boundary of the external skin, like this, but also it goes inside and down and rolls back again and so on and so on. So I suddenly realize I'm a very complex boundary indeed. And I say this is my boundary. And what I do, my actions, my behavior, are defined in terms of the movements of this boundary. But wait a minute. It's perfectly clear biologically that this boundary is a common boundary. It's not only my boundary, it's the boundary of the external world too. The skins are as much ours as the external world. If I draw a curved line, one side of the curve is concave, another side of the curve is convex. The concave belongs to one side, the convex belongs to the other side. All right, here is my nose. With respect to me, it is my side of the curve is concave. Space's side of the curve is convex. Now, the boundary moves. My nose goes this way and that way and the other way, looking around. And my hands, they move, and so on. And we in our society are taught to believe that the movement comes from this side of the boundary. That's where it starts. But as a matter of fact, we know better. We know that we don't know which side it starts from. That, in other words, the behavior, or the boundary of the organism is the boundary of the environment. The behavior of the organism is also the behavior of the environment. And there is no way of attributing the source of it to one side of the boundary or to the other. All we can do is describe the movement of the boundary and say what happens. Where it came from, we don't know. And in fact, we may have good reason to believe that the question, where did it come from, which side moved first, is meaningless. After all, take the simple movement of a curved line. It bulges, it goes convex on one side and concave on the other. Which side moved first? You see, it's a meaningless question. So as we get both in contemporary biology and in Eastern philosophy a conception of man as an organism environment field where the outside of the skin is as essential as the inside, and neither is one and neither is two, neither is first and neither is second, but both move simultaneously together.
ordinarily translated virtue. But virtue, as we understand it today, isn't at all appropriate. The nearest kind of, when we speak of the healing virtues of a plant, that's nearer to the meaning of this word, death. The Japanese pronounce it toku, the Cantonese dak, and the northern Mandarins approximately de. And in the section of the Lao Tzu where this is really introduced, the text says something like this: superior virtue, not virtue, thus it has virtue. Inferior virtue, can't let go of virtue, thus not virtue. And we more or less paraphrase that by translating, superior virtue is not conscious of itself as virtue, and therefore it is virtue. But inferior virtue is so hooked up with being virtuous, or hooked on being virtuous, that it's not virtue. Now then, therefore, this word is a connection of virtue and magic. It means the excellence of things, in the sense that a tree excels at being a tree, and nobody really knows how it does it. There is no way of imitating a tree, except the only thing is to be one. And so in the same way, when a human being shows extraordinary skill at something, it seems that it comes natural to him. It seems that he doesn't achieve it by any kind of artificiality. If there is some discipline in it, it's concealed. So, excelling in something naturally, and yet it's something that is so difficult to understand that it seems that it has been done by magic, is the meaning of this word. So what de is the state of affairs, a way of talking about particularly a human being who has learned to live in harmony with the Tao. Now, of course, everything is fundamentally in harmony with the Tao. In the book called the Zhongyong, or the Unwobbling Pivot, it is said, the Tao is that from which nothing can depart. That from which things can depart is not the Tao. Fundamentally, you see, you can't get away from it. It's like a situation in which we are all floating in a tremendous river. And the river carries you along, anyhow. Now, some of the people in the river are swimming against it, but they're still being carried along. Others have learned that the art of the thing is to swim with it. And they're carried along too. But they know it, you see. They know they're carried along, whereas the people who are swimming against it think they're going in the opposite direction. But they're not really. So that was a sort of discussion we were having this morning, when I find invariably, whenever I talk about these things, Americans raise moral issues because we are a people incredibly bamboozled by preachers. And so this always comes up. Bamboozled. Preachers. Yes. And have chronic guilty consciences. And so those questions are always raised. But this, you see, explains part of the situation. That you have to flow with the river. There is no other way. But that you can swim against it and pretend not to be flowing with it, but you still are. So, but a person who is not making that pretense anymore, who knows that you have to go with the river and swim with it, suddenly he acquires behind everything that he does the power of the river. The person swimming against the river, you see, does not by his action express the force of the river. The person swimming with it, he goes along and he has that whole river behind him, but he's subtly directing it, because you can change direction in the course of the river. You can go to the left or to the right, as a ship can use a rudder and still go along with the current, or more skillful still, as a sailboat can tack. Because when a sailboat tacks and goes in a direction contrary to the wind, it still is using the wind to blow it along. Now that is the most highly skillful art of all. That is Taoism in perfection, the art of sailing. Very intelligent. I remember once I was looking in the open air, and one of those glorious little thistledown things came, and I picked it up like that and brought it down, and it looked as if it was struggling to get away, just as if you caught an insect by one leg, like a daddy long legs or something of that kind. It seemed to be struggling to get away, and at first I thought, well, it's not doing that. That's just the wind blowing. But then I thought again, really? Only the wind blowing? Surely it is the structure of this thing which, in cooperation with the existence of wind, enables it to move like an animal, but using the wind's effort, not its own. It is more intelligent being than an insect, in a way, because an insect uses effort. Like a person who rows a boat uses effort, but the man who puts up a sail is using magic. He lets nature do it for him with the intelligence to use a sail, you see? So in just this way, the meaning of de is that kind of intelligence which, without your using very much effort, gets everything to cooperate with you. You, for example, never force other people to agree with you, but you give them the notion that the idea you wanted them to have was their own. This is a feminine art, preeminently. A woman who really wants a lover does not pursue him, because then most men feel that she's aggressive. And if she's aggressive, she obviously is a woman who has had difficulty in finding lovers, and therefore there must be some undesirably secret thing about her. But if she, as it were, makes a void, then, and is slightly difficult to get, then people get excited. They know she's a highly prized object, and so they pursue. Same way, when you want to teach a baby to swim, a thing you can do is to put the baby in the water, and then move backwards in the water and create a vacuum. And this pulls the baby along. It helps it to learn the feel of the water and how to swim. It's the same principle. So, also, clever, difficult-to-getness is one of the very best means of acquiring immense publicity. Take the case of T.E. Lawrence, who published The 7 Pillars of Wisdom in a limited edition. And this became an extraordinarily celebrated book. Costs hundreds of dollars a copy to find one, on the market. And they waited and waited and built this up and built this up and built this up, and finally they published a general edition. And it was a knockout, because the first one had been sort of secret and difficult to find. If you have patience, you see, you can always do this. So the whole art of the ruler, you see, the Tao Te Ching is a book written for several purposes. You may take it as a guide to mystical understanding of the universe. you may take it as a dissertation on the principles of nature, almost a naturalistic, a handbook of natural law, we would say. Or you may also take it as a political book, a book of wisdom for governors. And the principle which it advocates, basically, is the virtue of governing by not ruling. Look at it in this way. Supposing the President of the United States were as unknown to you by name as the local sanitary inspector, the man who looks after the drains and the sewage disposal and all that kind of thing. This is not a glamorous figure, you see. But for that very reason, he probably does his job more efficiently than the President, because the President wastes enormous amount of time in interviewing various groups from the Elks and the Girl Scouts and conferring honors and all this kind of thing. The poor man's life must be an utter torment because he's so well known and therefore has absolutely no time to give to the government of the country. I mean, think of his mail and all the people who have to be employed sifting that out and assessing it, so that if he were someone quite anonymous and that we didn't have to think about him, he would be a very, very good ruler. In just the same way, for example, you don't have to attend, unless you're sick, to the government of your own body. It happens automatically. This is this expression, Ziran, of itself, and it goes on day after day after day, and the better it is, the less you have to think about it. When you see well, you do not see your eyes. If there is something wrong with your eyes, you start seeing spots, and those spots are spots in your eyes. When you hear well, you never hear your ears. But when they start singing, you know, then you're starting to hear your ears, and your ears are getting in the way of their own hearing. So, on the deepest level, a person as a whole can get in the way of his own existence by becoming too aware of himself. And then he lacks this quality, de. Now, the Taoists then propose that there be something to help people get back to Tao and to be able to be in a state of de, so that they wouldn't get in their own way. And this is connected with the idea of being empty. Emptiness, being somehow vacant, was the secret of the thing. The highest kind of knowledge is not know-how, but know-how, N-O-H-O-W. To be able to do it know-how, without any method. To achieve this, something is practiced which is called fasting the heart. The heart, in Chinese, is a word which doesn't mean heart in the physiological sense. You see, it's part of the De character. Shin. It's usually located about here. And it means heart-mind. It's equivalently translated as mind. And in all the Zen texts where the word mind is used, no mind, mushin, it is this character. The psychic center. Now, the best kind of heart is absence of heart. In English, the word heartless has a very bad connotation, as does the word mindless. A heartless person is an inconsiderate, unfeeling person. A mindless person is an idiot. But a person who has mushin, or no mind, or no heart in Chinese, is a very high order of person. It means that his psychic center doesn't get in its own way. It operates as if it wasn't there. Zhuangzi says that the highest form of man uses his shin like a mirror. It grasps nothing. It refuses nothing. It receives but does not keep. And the poem says, when the geese fly over the water, and they are reflected in the water, that the geese do not intend to cast their reflection, and the water has no mind to retain their image. So, the whole thing is, you see, to operate in the world as if you were absent. Now, this is built into us physiologically, fundamentally. Let me ask you simply, what is the color of your head from the standpoint of your eyes? Your eyes don't see your head, do they? You look all around, and you see everything else, but your head you don't see. Do you feel that your head is black? No. Hasn't any color at all. Outside you see your field of vision is an oval with two eyes, and this creates a sort of two centers of an ellipse. So there's this whole field of vision. Now experiment. What is beyond the field of vision? What color is it where you can't see? It isn't black. This is an important point. It's no color at all beyond there. And in this way you can get an idea of what is meant by that character that I discussed this morning, Xuan, which although it formally has the meaning of darkness, this one, although it formally has the meaning of darkness and the deep and the obscure, it actually refers to this kind of no color, which is the color of your head, so far as your eyes are concerned. Now, so in this sense, the invisibility of one's head, almost the not having of any head at all, is the secret of being alive. To be headless, you might say, to have no head, in just the sense I'm talking about, is our way of talking about the Chinese expression mushin, no mind. Now, as a matter of fact, if you want to see the inside of your head, all you have to do is keep your eyes open. Because everything that you are experiencing in the external visual field is a state of your brain. All these colors and shapes are the way in which the brain nerves translate the electrical impulses in the external world, being the world outside the envelope of skin. So they translate all what is going on outside into impulses which are to us shape and color. But shape and color are states of the nerves, so what you see when your eyes are open is how it feels inside your head. You think your head is a blank, but actually it's being a blank. You don't see your brain as an external undulating corrugated structure. You see your brain as everything outside. So in this way, the emptiness of one's head is the condition of seeing. The transparency of the eye lens is the condition of seeing colors. It has no color itself. Eckhart said this, because my eye has no color, it is able to discern color. This is in Germany in the 13th century. This is fundamental Taoist idea of being absent as a condition of being present. Being not there. So, Zhuangzi says, when your belt is comfortable, you don't feel it. When your shoes are comfortable, it is as if you weren't wearing any. Likewise, your clothes, you see. The more you are aware of these things, the less properly they are made, or the less properly they fit. But we raise an objection to this, a very simple objection. If I don't know I'm there, I seem to be missing everything. We want to know that we know. If we're happy and we don't know we're happy, we might just as well not be happy. To be happy and to know that you're happy is really the overflowing of the cup of life. Of course, the penalty for that is to be miserable and to know that you're miserable. Some people are miserable without knowing it. But, you know my limerick, there was a young man who said, though it seems that I know, what I would like to see is the eye that knows me when I know that I know that I know. And this is the great human predicament. The development of self-consciousness, the development of the possibility of reflecting upon one's own knowledge. And this is simultaneously a blessing and a curse. And Taoism does not escape this problem. I mean, it doesn't avoid this problem, it deals with it. But it doesn't deal with it obviously. So we get back to this fundamental verse about the nature of De. What is highly virtuous is a virtue that is not conscious of itself as virtue. The moment it's conscious of itself as such, you see, it fails. So in this way, we love to see a child dancing all by itself, lost in the dance, and not performing for an audience. And we say, oh, if only I could dance like that. If only I could become like a child again, innocent. But then soon we know when parents notice how beautifully a child dances, and they all approve of it and say to this child, dance for us, the child begins to lose this power. And it puts on airs, it knows it's noticed. And we don't like that. We say, that's affectation, that's showing off, that's phony. What we want you to do is to dance as if you had no audience, not even yourself. Which of course puts the child in a double bind. Because it says to the child, we require you to do something that will be acceptable only if you do it as if it wasn't required. We do that all the time to our children and to each other. You must love me. After all, you promised to do so when we got married, didn't you? And so on. So, this is the difficulty. But somehow, the very great artist, in the maturity of his life, somehow is able, at least to give the impression that he does what he does without playing to the gallery, without self-consciousness. It seems perfectly natural. So how does he get there? There was a Taoist sage, later than Lao Tzu. His name was Liezi. We romanize that as L-I-E-H, Liezi. And he had a reputation for being able to ride on the wind. So light. Zhuangzi says in one place, it's easy enough to stand still. The difficulty is to walk without touching the ground. Because in the state of being in accord with the Tao, there is a certain feeling of weightlessness, parallel to the weightlessness that people feel when they get into outer space or when they go deep into the ocean. This is, of course, connected with the sensation that you're not carrying your body around. I described this morning the sensation that an expert driver has when he really is with it in a car, that the hill lifts him up and drops him down the other side, that he and the road are all one process. And that's equivalent to the sense of weightlessness. And so this is connected to, this is the inner meaning of Lietze riding on the wind. When Suzuki was asked, what is it like to have Satori, he said, it's just like ordinary everyday experience, except about 2 inches off the ground. And so we say in our own songs, walking on air, never a care, something is making me sing, tra-la-la-la, like a little bird in spring. What is this then, weightlessness? It means, of course, partly that you're not moving around in constant opposition to yourself. Most people move in constant opposition to themselves because they are afraid that if they don't oppose themselves all the time, something awful will happen. See, it's so easy to bend your arm. No problem at all. But supposing you make a fight about it, and you take these antagonistic muscles, as they're called, and fight them against each other, so that you have to bend your arm like that. See? Well, how ridiculous. But if you somehow felt that in bending your arm you might make a mistake, instead of bending it, you might hit yourself. Then these two muscles get nervous, and they fight each other to be sure that everything happens all right. That's anxiety, see? So, when the human being developed the power to be aware of himself, to know that he knows, in other words, when the cortex was formed over the original brain, he fell from grace. That was the fall of man. Because when he felt, he had the sensation of being in charge, of being in control of himself, and you can only have that sensation when you are aware of what you're doing, he got anxious. Am I aware enough of myself? Have I taken enough factors into consideration? Have I done all that should be done? And then he started trembling. This was the fall of man, of course. This is what is meant. Lao Tzu says, when the great Tao lost, there came duty to man and right conduct. In other words, nobody talks about how you ought to behave unless things have gone radically wrong. There wouldn't be any conception of faithful ministers of the state unless there were a lot of lousy politicians around. No one would talk about filial piety unless there were wayward sons and daughters. So there is constantly in the tradition of Taoism the idea that all moral preaching is confusion. There's a marvelous case of this in the Zhuangzi book, where there's an alleged conversation between Confucius and Lao Tzu, in which Lao Tzu asks Confucius to explain to him what is charity and duty to one's neighbor. And Confucius gives him a little sermon, on being, giving up one's self-interest and working for others. And Lao Tzu says, what stuff? Sir, regard the universe. He says, the stars come out invariably every night. The sun rises and sets, the birds flock and migrate, without exception. All flowers and trees grow upwards without exception. You, by your talk of charity and duty to one's neighbor, you're just introducing confusion into the empire. Your attempt to eliminate self is a positive manifestation of selfishness. You are like a person beating a drum in search of a fugitive. The modern equivalent of that would be the police car about to raid a bad nightclub and coming with its siren full on. See? And everybody in the club gets out. So, all talk about selfishness, all talk about success in becoming virtuous, or enlightened, or integrated, or non-neurotic, or self-actualized. Let's use all the terms that are being used. All this talk attests to the fact that it hasn't happened, and will in fact get in the way of its happening. Well, to go back to Lietzer, who succeeded in riding the wind, what happened? Lietzer found a very great master and went to study with him. And the master lived in a